Wonderful. Well, we're going to be thinking this morning, as we talked already, about listening to God. And just before she died, Mother Teresa made a rare television appearance. And at one point in the interview that she was having, the journalist asked her, "When you pray to God, what do you say?" And she answered, "I don't say anything, I listen." She was referring to a stage of prayer that sadly many followers of Jesus never step into. But for those who do, it's a whole nother dimension to life, walking with God, our Good Shepherd. As I sat down, actually, to write this talk, I received a message from a friend, literally within the first 15 minutes, who wanted some guidance about a decision that he and his family were making. And he said, "Would you pray and would you listen to God?" And I thought, this is kind of speaking into what I'm about to write on. And actually, God did give me something to share with him, which was an encouragement. So it was good to be able to kind of begin by putting this stuff into practice. Because the whole point of looking at this stuff isn't so it can just remain head knowledge, but so we can live it out. And so that was an encouragement for me and for him, I hope. But I wonder how you feel as you hear these words, listen to God. Maybe it's something that excites you. Maybe it's a completely alien concept and, you're perhaps familiar with the idea of talking to God, but the idea of God talking to you, no, that's not possible, surely. Maybe you are a little nervous of the idea that God might want to speak to us. Or maybe you're just thinking, well, maybe he does that, but he won't want to speak to me. But what I want us to get hold of this morning is that every single one of us, no matter who we are, no matter how long we've been following Jesus, whether we even are following Jesus, can hear the voice of God. And the reason that I'm so confident about this isn't because I'm super spiritual. It's not because I'm trying to push an understanding of human relationships onto our relationship with God. It's because Jesus says we can. The idea of listening to God comes from Jesus himself, and we just heard that read by Jess as she read us those first few verses of John chapter 10. And the first thing I want us to get hold of as we explore this idea of listening to God, of hearing from him, is deeply profound. It requires a lot of understanding and depth of insight. And so I hope that we are feeling switched on and ready for such things this morning. It's incredibly complicated and complex. Are we ready? Are we feeling nervous? If we are going to be people this morning who can hear the voice of God, then first and foremost, we've got to be like a sheep. We've got to be like a sheep. I don't know. Oh, there we go. If you've ever seen a sheep running around a field, if you were here for Jordan's talk a little while ago, where that sheep kept falling into the same hole despite being rescued again and again and again, then you'll realize that being a sheep isn't actually that complex and complicated. And I am sorry for anybody who owns sheep or has a particular passion for sheep. I don't feel like they've had a very good reputation in recent talks here at St. Michael's, but sheep, we love you anyway. Being a sheep, though, this is the point, involves sticking close to the shepherd and expecting him to speak. Sticking close to the shepherd and expecting him to speak. And in the passage we just had read for us, Jesus likens himself to the shepherd and us, his disciples, his followers, to sheep. And we heard that in verses 2-5. And then he goes on in verse 14 of this same passage in chapter 10. Jesus says, "I'm the good shepherd. I know my sheep, and my sheep know me." And then verse 27, "My sheep listen to my voice. I know them, and they follow me." The key to being able to listen to God is not about becoming super spiritual. It's this. We need to realize that like a shepherd speaks and the sheep hear his voice, so too God speaks. And as his children, we can all hear his voice. Just as a sheep expects to hear their shepherd guiding and leading them, so we can expect to hear from God as we draw near to him. Because our God is not a silent God. He speaks, and as his children, we can hear his voice. I love when I look through scripture, realizing the kinds of people that God speaks to. People perhaps who are rather unexpected. People who don't have it all together. People who aren't the most elite and experienced. Again and again, God speaks to normal, everyday, broken people, far from perfect. Because he loves to communicate with his people, and he hasn't changed. He is still the same. God loves to speak to us. We don't have to twist his arm in any way. And maybe this morning you need to be reminded that God can speak to you. I remember a few years ago when I was a youth worker, at a different church, and I led a youth weekend away, and at the weekend we laid out cards, encouragement cards, which had the young people's names on the top, and we encouraged them over the course of the weekend to write little messages to their friends, their fellow youth group members. But we said, instead of just writing things like, nice t-shirt, I like your hair, I like the perfume you're wearing, we encouraged them to maybe listen to God and see what he said. Or if they felt they couldn't do that, just to write something encouraging and kind and nice. But anyway, these cards came back with remarkable things in them. And my card had all sorts of things where the young people had listened to God and had clearly heard God speak, because there were things written in there that they would not have known. But there was one particular guy, I'm going to call him Matt for the sake of this talk, and he was a 13-year-old guy in the youth group, and a cheeky chap who was full of life, but he was like, I can't hear from God. And, he quite enjoyed telling me repeatedly, he's like, Ellie, you're getting us to do this, but I can't hear from God. Anyway, I got home, and his message, more than any of the others, really spoke to me. And anyway, I at that time was thinking about moving on from that job, and all sorts of other stuff was going on, and I really needed guidance, and this really helped, along with a bunch of other things that had happened. And anyway, I did hand my notice in at this job, and when I told the youth group a few weeks later that this is what had happened, I thought, I can't not tell Matt what his encouragement had meant to me, and actually just as much anything to encourage him that he really can hear from God. So anyway, I told him, I said, you were a significant part. That word you shared on my encouragement card, despite the fact you thought you could not hear the Lord, really spoke to me and was key in helping me make decisions. And his sister was outraged, and she said, it's all your fault that she's leaving. Why did you listen to God? But, there's just a little example. We do not have to be kind of what we might expect to be able to hear God's voice. But I do think what we can do is only make space to listen when we're faced with big decisions, when we want guidance over a particular situation, whether it's job or housing or relationship or finances. And perhaps we can turn this whole listening to God thing into something a little more like fortune telling, where we put in a few minutes of prayer and waiting on God and get something back, and then we kind of wait until the next time where we, expect that he might speak again. And a listening to God can become more akin to a visit to the doctor rather than a meet up with a friend, because we only go if something hurts or we want something. Whereas listening to God is meant to be more about meeting with a friend, something that we do regularly in the everyday, in the normal rhythms of life. When we sit down to listen, not just to get a sense of direction or something specific, but rather just to follow the nudges of our Good Shepherd for that day, whatever that might look like. And you might be wondering, well, how on earth does this work? God doesn't have a body. He doesn't have vocal cords. I can't go and meet him down in the coffee shop and have a chat. How on earth can I hear his voice? Well, the truth is there is no one-size-fits-all formula for this discerning God's voice thing. God comes to each of us inside the contours of our own life, our personalities, our backgrounds, our characters, and our life stages. And next week, David's going to be picking up the specifics of how we can hear the voice of God. But what I want us to get hold of this week is, if we're going to hear, then we need to make space and we need to draw close. If we're going to hear, we need to make space and we need to draw close. a few practical things that I've found helpful is just to take some time to be quiet, to stop whatever it is that I'm doing and make space for God to speak. Because a bit like in a human relationship, if we're standing really far away and there's all sorts of other noise going on and we're just doing all the talking, then actually it can be really hard to hear what someone else is saying. That's how it works in human relationships, and actually that's how it works with God. So be quiet and make space. Something else I find super helpful is having my Bible open in front of me, because actually the primary way, as I know David's going to be talking next week, that God speaks to us is through the Bible. It's through his word that we have written down. This is how God speaks to us. Come expectant. Hopefully this talk will have raised some kind of expectation in us. But let's be expectant that God would speak to us. Come with a sense of expectation. Also, I used to find, I'll tell you my little story in a minute with this whole stuff, but journaling really helpful. Actually, just having a pen and paper and being ready to write things down that we sense that God might be saying. And don't worry if you're like, I'm not sure this is God or not. Just pop it down and actually, over the course of time, discern with others and with the Lord what that might mean and what that might be about. But like in a human relationship, if we're far away, if there's loads of noise and distractions, it can be hard to hear. So we need to make space and we need to draw close. When I was single, I used to spend hours over the course of a week. Some days were better than others, but I used to, it was a regular thing that I would sit with my Bible open with a hot cup of coffee, with my journal, worship music, and I would pray and I would listen to God. This was a very normal kind of practice. But now, invariably, and maybe some others in the room can share this experience, my day begins with being bundled on the bed, attempting to pray to the backdrop of Bluey or the Octonauts, before then getting covered in Weetabix. That kind of relaxing moment of starting the day with the Lord, it looks different in this season of life. And I did wonder why on earth I'd been asked to give this talk when I feel like this is one of the harder practices in a noisy household when there's a lot going on. But actually, I have discovered in this time, even with tiny ones, is that when I do make space to listen to God, even if it's sitting down to write a talk and praying, God help, which actually did happen. When I sat down to write this talk, I was like, God help. What on earth am I going to say about listening to God at the moment and being quiet and having no noise around? But I just sensed God say, even then, in that little prayer, Ellie, shut your laptop. I was like, I can't. I need to get this done. I've only got so many hours without the children. But I felt God say, shut your laptop and just be still. And I did reluctantly, if I'm really honest. And God just filled me with a sense of peace and calm. There was nothing deeply profound or super spiritual about that. And it's a pretty underwhelming story, if I'm honest. But actually, God spoke to me, and it was a real blessing. God loves to communicate with us. Hearing from God isn't about being qualified or a spiritual heavyweight. It's about leading into a God who is kind and who loves to communicate with us. And we can be so blessed as we allow him to speak. I remember just really briefly, when I was working with students, actually, we encouraged them to do some activity listening to God. It was a little opportunity to get into threes and pray for each person in turn and just have 2 minutes, literally, not very long at all, just to listen to God. And there was this one girl being prayed for, and the people praying for her, one of them had a picture of her getting on a plane, and the other had a picture of a pile of bricks. And this girl they were praying for was about to go and work for IJM, do a placement with them, an internship, an anti-slavery organization whose mission was to bring about the end of slavery around the world. And she wanted to go abroad, but she didn't know which country to go to. And so, these two people, one had a picture of her getting on a plane and one had a pile of bricks. After the seminar, she put it to one side. She didn't know what the heck that meant. So she made a decision. Anyway, she applied to go to the Philippines, but for various reasons, that didn't work out. And she was put on the India program to go and work in Chennai. And when she found out what the focus of the work that she was going to be doing in Chennai was, she couldn't believe it, because a key part of their work was freeing people from bonded labor in brick kilns. You know, that picture of the bricks, which seems so random and obscure, was spot on, and it was a huge encouragement to her that she knew that God knows and sees. And her testimony after that was, I could sing for ages about how much God has taught me of who he is through this. We had a prayer meeting here on Wednesday night, and all sorts of people came. Loads of people came, and we were praying in different ways around this building. And over there was a little opportunity to listen to God as we in the context of this prayer meeting. And it was so encouraging to hear what people were sharing when we had an opportunity to feed back at the end if anyone wanted to. And often it began with, I don't really know what this means, or this is a bit random, and I'm not really sure what God's saying through this. But actually, there was a real kind of connection of themes and vision, and the same Bible verses were coming up. And it was so encouraging to see, even in that little moment, that God was speaking. The more we spend time with our Father, the clearer his voice becomes. Spending time with our Good Shepherd will help us hear his voice. And Jesus is saying here in John 10 that all who are truly his sheep will know his voice and follow it. Because this is what a disciple is, someone who knows the voice of their shepherd and who follows. And so if the main thing that this morning that we're going to get hold of is to be like sheep, to stay close to our shepherd and expect him to speak, then the second and final thing, and I finish with this, is that we are to be people who follow the shepherd. We are to be people who follow the shepherd, because discipleship, followership, isn't about learning a doctrine or knowing rules and regulations. It's an interactive, dynamic, living relationship with a living God who loves to speak to us. In Luke 10, we read of how Mary, one of Jesus' disciples, sat at his feet and listened to what he was saying. And in that context, the idea of sitting at the feet of your rabbi was basically the heart of discipleship. It meant that you listened to and then went on to do what they said. You know, I just spent a really lovely month off with my family. And one of the things we did when we were off was we went on a pedalo, which, you know, was brilliant. But I think that sometimes, sorry, I'm going to tell you a different story first because I've skipped ahead. This is probably more relevant to this part of the talk. I spent a glorious month off with family, but it has also been a test of patience. The pedalo can wait for another day. And I have said more times than I care to remember over the summer holiday, where are your listening ears? Where are your listening ears? You know, I wish I could just press a button and it would save my voice and there it would just go again. But, you know, there is another step to listening, because we can hear, can't we? But actually, when we're asking something to listen, when we're asking someone to listen, whether it's a child or an adult, we're not just meaning make eye contact and hear the sounds coming out of our mouths. We mean do it. Please, please. And Jesus is saying here, you know, as we're called to listen, we're also called to obey. We're also called to obey and to follow what he says. Obedience is key to discipleship, but actually it's not always very popular. It flies in the face of a culture which encourages us to do whatever we want to do whenever we want to do it. To live our best life, we've got to do what feels right and not be bound by anyone or anything. And if something doesn't fit in or we don't like it, we can just cancel them or it out. But this isn't the way of God's kingdom. This isn't the way of God's kingdom. Parting words are often significant. And we can read Jesus' parting words in Matthew 28, where he says, go and make disciples of all nations. This is after everything, after his death, his resurrection, all his teaching, all that he's done here on earth. He says, go, make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded. This was Jesus' great commission. This is what he wanted to leave ringing in our ears as he went to be with his Father in heaven. To be people who listen to and who follow the way of life he set before us. And yet, so often we don't want to. We want to have a foot in both camps. We want to follow our shepherd a little bit. This is where the pedalo comes in. We had a pedalo ride when we were on holiday. And I don't know if you've ever been on a pedalo, but there's that moment where or any boat for that matter, where you kind of have one foot in the boat and one foot on the pontoon. And it's just that hairy moment where you're kind of there and the boat's wobbling. And it's, that's the moment that you're probably more likely than not to take a splash. I used to quite enjoy, and I probably shouldn't admit this, when I used to live in Cambridge and I was working with the students there, I used to quite enjoy watching people punt, and they would have one foot on the bank of the river and one foot in the boat and a big pole in their hand, and often the pole would go one way, they would go another way, and the boat would go another way, and there would be an almighty splash. They were always fine because they were only falling in the water, but it was quite amusing. The point of this is that having a foot in both camps doesn't work. Jesus' words here are teaching them to obey everything, teaching us to follow him wholeheartedly. That is what being a disciple of Jesus is about. And there are all sorts of things that can get in the way of that. Maybe this morning for us, it's a lack of trust, a doubt whether God has our best interests at heart. Maybe we just don't want to. Maybe his ways don't fit our ideals and our ideas. Perhaps this morning we're actually terrified of what he might ask us if we make space to listen. I wonder what stands in the way for you. Do we trust that obedience to God is not an obstacle on the path to a happy life? It is the path. Do we believe that God's ways are good? When we choose to follow him, it doesn't mean that we put on an invisibility cloak and become shielded from all suffering and pain. For those of us that have followed Jesus for a while now will know that that is not true. But listening to and following our good shepherd is the safest place that we can be. In the big things and the small things, in the life-changing decisions and the mundane every day, as we listen and follow God's call in our lives, we find life in abundance. A few verses later in that same chapter of John's Gospel, Jesus says, I've come that you may have life and have it to the full. And once we trust God's good intentions towards us, the driving force of our life will be increasingly to listen to his voice. So are we following the call of our shepherd today? Have we given him control of our lives? Or have we got one foot in and one foot out? Maybe there's a specific area you know that God has been speaking to you, but you don't really want to follow. Maybe you feel you can't follow. Perhaps it feels too overwhelming. Maybe there are areas that you need to release to God this morning. Not just worries and fears, perhaps, but maybe behaviors and ways of life that are not in line with his will. Our good shepherd is one who loves to give us a fresh start. And what I love about those parting words of Jesus in Matthew is it doesn't end with obey everything I've commanded. Those final words are surely I'm with you always to the very end of the age. Because you see, he calls us to listen, yes. He calls us to obey, yes. But he also says, I'm going with you as you do this stuff. I am with you always. There is nowhere that you can go where you will not be in my company. I am with you. I am with you. And so we can come to him and ask for his help as we seek to be people who follow wholeheartedly, listen to what he says, and obey. Listening to God is not about becoming super spiritual. It's simply realizing that God speaks, and as children, we can hear his voice. So what are we waiting for? We're going to make an opportunity now as invite the prayer team and the band to come up to listen to the voice of God, to pray for one another, to ask for God's help, that we might unlock this way of communicating with him. You know, like Matt in my youth group, or, you know, some of the guys that discovered on Wednesday night here at the prayer meeting that God does speak. Let's pray. I invite you to stand where you are.